Okay, today I'm going to be teaching you how to factor harder problems. If you remember on the previous lesson, the one right before this, I taught you how to use a table to find the roots to an equation or find the factors of an equation. And if you understood that lesson, this lesson should not be that hard for you. We're still going to use the same idea as before, but there's a couple little things I want to point out to you. Today, what you're going to notice is that this coefficient in front of the x squared is not going to be 1. And every problem we did in the last lesson, it's been 1. And today, what you're going to find, it's going to be a negative number or it's going to be some other number other than 1. And when that happens, you're going to have to learn how to deal with those kind of things in your table. And there's two things you need to make sure you're following here. Make sure that a is a positive number first and that there's no common factor in these numbers. And I'll talk about it as we go. But in this first problem, let's go ahead and look at it. The coefficient of x squared is a negative 1. Now there's a lot of ways to do this, but the way I like to do it is I'm going to factor out a negative 1. So basically what I'm going to do is divide everything by a negative 1. So if I divide everything by a negative 1, I end up with negative 1x squared divided by a negative 1 is x squared. 3x divided by negative 1 is negative 3x. And negative 2 divided by negative 1 is positive 2. So that's what I'm going to do first. Then I'm going to go ahead and make my table just like before. So this is going to be 1x squared. This is going to be a product of 2. And it's going to be a sum of negative 3. Okay, so what two numbers multiply to get 1x squared? Well, obviously 1 and 1. All right, now I want a product that's positive 2, but a sum that's negative 3, which is a key to me right now that it's probably going to be two negative numbers that multiply to a negative 2. I'm sorry, to a positive 2, but give a sum of a negative 3. Well, it's pretty obvious it's going to have to be negative 1 and negative 2. And let's go ahead and check that. 1 times a negative 1 is negative 1. 1 times a negative 2 is negative 2. And a negative 1 plus a negative 2 does give me a sum of negative 3. So that's the sum that I wanted. So remember what I do. I put my x's back in, right? And I put the middle and the ends together. And that's going to be really important today that you focus in on that, because if you put the wrong ones together, this is not going to work. So my two factors are x minus 1 and x minus 2. And if you wrote that as your answer, you'd actually be wrong, because you got to remember at the very beginning of this problem, we factored out a negative 1, so we need to include a negative 1 in our answer. Negative 1 times x minus 1 times x minus 2. If I go ahead and do the Punnett square for this, I will end up with the x squared minus 3x plus 2, right? And then I'm going to have to multiply by the negative 1, and I'll end up back where I did. On your homework tonight, you do need to check the Punnett square. All right, let's go ahead and try another example. Example 2. Okay, first things first. Is this coefficient negative? No. So since the 3 is not negative, then I'm going to look at the 3, look at the 8, look at the 4, and ask yourself, is there a number that I could divide them all by? Well, the answer is no. And since the answer is no, we're just going to go ahead and make our table. In a few minutes, the answer is going to be yes. I'm going to show you what to do. So we're going to make our table. This is going to be 3x squared. I want a product of 4, and I want a sum of 8, right? Or 8x if you want to think of it that way. All right, so I want a product of 4 and a sum of 8. So what two numbers multiply to give you 3? Now, you don't have to consider negative numbers here for a lot of reasons, but let's just keep it simple today. Only think about positive numbers here. So the only thing it could be is 1 and 3. All right? Well, what two numbers multiply to 4 but add to 8? Okay, so 1 and 3, and what two numbers multiply to 4? Well, there's a couple options, so we got to be careful here. It could be a 1 and a 4, but I want you to see this. It could also be a 4 and a 1, and they're going to give me two different answers. And if that didn't work, it could also be a 2 and a 2. So 1 and 3 with each one of those could possibly be the answer. And let's see which one works. Well, 1 times 1 is 1, right? First times first is 1, times 1 is 1, 3 times 4 is 12, 1 plus 12 is 13, not the sum that I'm looking for. Let's try the next one. 1 times 4 is 4, 3 times 1 is 3, 3 plus 4 is 7, not the one I'm looking for. Let's try the next one. 1 times 2 is 2, 3 times 2 is 6, 2 plus 6 is 8. I found it, right? That's the sum I wanted. All right, so once I find the one I wanted, I go ahead and put my x's back. So that's 1x and that's 3x. And remember what I've said a million times now, the middle and the ends come together. Oops, come together. So what are my two factors? My two factors are 3x plus 2 and x plus 2. Okay. On the next problem, let's go to the next one. First things first, is the coefficient negative? The answer is no, right? Is there a common denominator here? The answer is no. In that case, I just go ahead and make my table. All right. I want to make 4s squared. I want a product of 5 and a sum of negative 9. All right. Well, I got to be careful here because this 4 could be a 1 and a 4, but it could also be a 2 and a 2. So I'm going to start off by 1 and 4. But if 1 and 4 does not work, then I'm going to try everything else with 2 and 2. So I want a product that's positive, but a sum that's negative. That's a key to telling me that that's 5. The two numbers multiplying are both negative. So my first guess would be, well, let's try -1 and -5, and let's see what that gives us. 1 times -1 is -1. 4 times -5 is -5. I'm sorry, 4 times -5 is -20. -1 plus -20 is -21. Nope. Try it again. This time, flip the 5 and the 1 around, and notice it's going to give me a different sum. 1 times a -5 is a -5. 4 times a -1 is a -4. -5 plus -4 is a -9, and it works. All right? If that did not work, I would then try the same thing with 2 and 2, but I'm not going to go ahead and do that. But you would have to try 2 and 2 with -1 and -5 and see what happens. But we already found it, so let's go ahead and put our s's back in, right? S and S. And remember, once again, the middles and the ends come together to make your factors. So my answers are 4s minus 5 and s minus 1. All right. Next problem's a little bit harder, but a good next step. First thing you check for to make sure this coefficient of the h squared is positive. It is. Then check, is there a number that I could divide all three of these chunks by? Yes, I can divide them all by 2. So what I'm going to start off doing is factoring out a 2. Take out a 2 from everything. I can divide all three of these numbers by 2, and I end up with 2h squared plus 13h minus 7. Okay? And that's going to be the table. That's a really bad table. But that's going to be the table that I'm going to use. All right. 2h squared plus 13h minus 7. Excuse me for the horrible drawing there. Let's go ahead and make our table. All right. I'm going to deal with the 2 now. So 2h squared, -7 product, sum that's positive 13. All right. So my first thing is, well, it's going to be 1 and 2. Now, I want a -7, so that's going to be 1 positive and 1 negative. So let's try -1 and +7. If that does not work, I would then have to try 7 with a -1. And if that didn't work, then I would have to try a 1 with a -7 and a -7 with a 1. But let's go ahead and try this first one. 1 times a -1 is -1. 2 times 7 is 14. -1 plus 14 is 13. I found it on the first try. But like I said, if that didn't work, I would then have to try 7 with a -1. Then I would have to try 1 with a -7. and then I would have to try a -7 with the 1. One of those is probably the answer. If none of those work, then you're really in trouble because you're going to have to do something else. So I put my h's back in, right? And I end up with 2h minus 1 and h plus 7. So there's my two factors. 2h minus 1 and h minus 7. And don't forget, we factored out a 2 at the beginning, so we need to put that 2 back in. Okay, let's go ahead and do another problem. We're almost done here. All right. Oops. Had a technical difficulty there for a second, but we're going to go ahead and try this next problem. I want you to notice real quick that this is the first problem in which it's equal to something. And since it's equal to something, we're actually going to solve it. We're not just going to factor it. We're going to solve this problem. So, first thing you want to do, is this coefficient negative? The answer is no, right? Second thing, is there a number that I can divide all three chunks by? The answer is yes. I can divide everything by 5, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to divide both sides by 5. 10b squared divided by 5 is going to be 2b squared. Negative 35 divided by 5 is -7. Check that. That n should be a b, so go ahead and fix that now. -7b, sorry about the typo, plus 15 divided by 5 is 3. And here's the cool thing. 0 divided by 5 is still 0. So I don't have to keep the 5 around this time. If you remember the other problems we just did, we had to keep the factor, the thing that we took out, off to the side. But this time, since we divided both sides by 5, I can actually get rid of it. All right? So now I need to factor this. So I'm going to make my table. So I want 2b squared. I want a product of 3 and a sum of -7. Well, first things first, I know it's going to be a 1 and a 2. Okay, next thing, it's a positive product but a negative sum, so it's probably two negative numbers. So my first guess would be -1 and a -3. Let's check that. 1 times a -1 is -1. 2 times a -3 is -6. -1 plus a -6 is a -7. I found it on the first try. So, remember, put your b's back in. The middles and the ends come together. These come together, and those come together. So I'm left with 2b minus 1 times b minus 3 equals 0. Now remember, everything what we've been learning earlier in these lessons, that if you have a number times another number that equals 0, right? Two things being multiplied that equals 0, then either A or B, one of those two, either A or B has to be 0. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 2b minus 1, and I'm going to make it equal to 0. And I'm going to take b minus 3, and I'm going to make it equal to 0. Solve each one, so add 1 to both sides, plus 1 plus 1. I end up with 2b equals 1. Divide by 2, I end up with b is equaling to 1/2. On the second equation, if I add 3 to both, I end up with b equaling 3. So my answers is 1 1/2, not 1/3, 1/2 and +3. So my two answers are 1/2 and +3. All right, let's try another problem. In the next problem, I need to first make it equal to 0. So my first job is to bring the 3 over, right? And I end up with 2x squared plus 5x plus 3. Okay, equals 0. All right, go ahead and set up our table for this to factor it. This is going to be a pretty easy one. 2x squared, +3, +5x. All right, well, this is 1 and 2, and this is 1 and 3, or possibly 3 and 1. and I think it's going to be the second one, but let's check both. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 3 is 6, 6 plus 1 is 7, too big, right? All right, then try the second one. 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 plus 3 is 5. I found it. So my two factors are, put my x's back in, middles and in goes together. I end up with 2x plus 3 times x plus 1 equals 0. Solve each one separately and get your answers. Subtract 3 from both sides, you end up with 2x equals negative 3. Divide both sides by 2, you end up with x equaling negative 3 halves. Subtract 1 from both sides, you end up with x equaling negative 1. So my two answers are negative 3 halves and negative 1. All right? Not too hard. Same process over and over again. All right, our last two problems. Now for these last two, I don't say it in the notes, but what you want to do is you want to find the zeros of this equation. So this is a graph of some equation, and you want to find the zeros, which is a big way for saying, you know, g of x is another word for y, and what we're going to do is we're going to make y 0. So we're going to end up with this equation. 0 equals negative 3x squared minus 13x minus 4. So that's the problem we're going to do. All right, now notice x squared is negative, so if that's going to happen tonight, the first thing I want you to do is divide both sides by a negative 1. Okay, I end up with 0 equaling 3x squared plus 13x plus 4. All right, make our table for this. And remember, since you divided both sides by a negative 1, you don't have to factor out a negative 1. You can just get rid of the negative 1. So 3x squared, positive 4, positive 13. All right, 1 and 3. Now, real quick, you probably are going to want to use 2 and 2 and 4 and 1. But if you look at this number real quick, it's a 13. It's a pretty big number. So you're probably going to multiply the 3 times some big number to get that 13. So my first guess would be to try a 1 and a 4. And I think that's going to work. So this one actually does work. So 1 times 1 is 1. 3 times 4 is 12. 1 plus 12 is 13. Found it on the first try. So my factors are 3x plus 1 and x plus 4. Because remember, all I do is put my x's back in here, right? And the middles and the ends go together, right? We end up with that. So my two answers are 3x plus 1 equals 0 and x plus 4 equals 0. Subtract 1 from both sides, we get 3x equals negative 1. Divide both sides by 3, we get x equals negative 1/3. And if we subtract 4 from both sides, we end up with x equaling negative 4. So my other answer is negative 4. All right, last problem. This one, if you were doing this one, I would probably stop the video and go try this problem yourself to see if you can get it right. Because if you can get this right, you can probably do pretty much anything on the homework assignment tonight. So let's go ahead and try this last one. All right, first things first, make that into y and make it equal to 0. All right, so we're going to do the same problem, but we're going to make it equal to 0. They're going to say find the zeros. If you see a quadratic equation and you're not sure what to do, 98% of the time, you want to make it equal to 0 and solve it. Find the roots, find the zeros means solve it. So set it up first. F of x is y, make it equal to 0, and solve it. Ooh, it's negative, so I want to divide by a negative, but I also notice that these are all multiples of 4. So I'm going to start off really smart and divide both sides by a negative 4. I divided by a negative 4 because I want to get rid of this negative coefficient of the x squared, right? So be careful with that. Divide by a negative and divide by 4. So let's do that. So we end up with 0 equaling 2x squared plus, let's see, 52 divided by 4 is, what is that going to be, 13? Plus, oops, not plus, because it's going to be minus, and I'll show you why. 28 divided by a negative 4 is going to be a negative 7. All right, so there's my table, right? We get 2x squared, negative 7, positive 13. Well, that's going to be 1 and 2. Now watch this. This is a pretty big positive number, so I know I'm going to have one positive, one negative. And I have a 2 here, so I'm probably going to multiply the 2 by the 7. And I want a positive 7 because I want it to be a big positive number. So my first guess would be negative 1 and positive 7. And I think that's going to work. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. 2 times 7 is 14. Negative 1 times, or sorry, negative 1 plus 14 is 13. I found it. So there's my two roots, right? Go ahead and put your x's back in. The middles and the ends come together, so I'm left with 2x minus 1 and x plus 7. Equals 0. All right? Solve both of them. We end up with 2x minus 1 equals 0 and x plus 7 equals 0. Add 1 to both sides, we end up with 2x equaling 1. Divide both sides by 2, x is equal to 1/2. Do the second one, subtract 7 from both sides. Oops, running out of room here. And my other answer is x is equal to 1/2 and x is equal to a negative 7. And there you have it. Factoring harder quadratics. Just keep using the table. You'll probably be pretty fast at it. Be careful with the negatives. Make sure you get rid of negative coefficients. Make sure you get rid of common denominators, and these problems are not that hard. Good luck with this.